So, without further ado, let's get into Houdini. If you open Houdini, this is probably more or less what you'll see. I've got my walkthrough off to the side here. So we'll be moving that across. We'll get back to that later. First thing, I'm not a light background person, so we'll change that to a dark background. So to do that, you press D, go to background here, and change it to dark. Navigation, Alt plus middle mouse gives you your panning, Alt plus right click gives you your zoom. You can go up and down or left to right. For orbiting, Alt left click. I believe this is either very close to or similar to Maya. Actually, I'm going to backtrack a bit. I think I missed a section. Let's go back. What did I miss? Okay, we're jumping around a bit. Firstly, what is procedural modeling? I got too excited to talk about Houdini. So, moving back. Procedural modeling is a technique that automates part of the 3D modeling process. So this can mean having an editable object. Think about how you can adjust the height, width, segments of a cube in Maya, Blender, Houdini too, all of that at a click of a button. Well, it's that, but it's more advanced. Because now when you extrude or you bevel or whatever, you can still go back and change those segments without destroying your extrudes and your bevels later down the line. So the point of procedural modeling is to work as non-destructively as possible. So yeah, that's the point of 3D modeling. Brief overview of what it is. Going back to the actual fun stuff now, which is Houdini. So quick recap, navigation is basically the same for Maya. Use Alt, left, right, middle. There you go. Now, over here you have a bit like your outliner. In other 3D software, your navigation is the same, middle mouse for panning, right mouse to zoom. Okay, so this is a bit of a weird thing. I've sometimes found that I can't pan in the viewport without using Alt. So Alt is optional. Sometimes it works without, sometimes it doesn't, but for the outliner, generally speaking, you can just use middle mouse and right click. So your first node is going to be a geometry node. You get this menu by pressing Tab. Geometry node, because we're going to be working with geometry. Now, what is a geometry node? I don't know if this is really the technical description of it, but I would like to call it a bit of like a group in your outliner in Maya or Blender or whatever you use, because everything you create is kind of placed within that. If you're going to, okay, yeah, quick note, you don't need to use Alt, yes. I sometimes had a problem, it doesn't work. 90% of the time it works without Alt. Right, so tab, we're going to use geometry node. So let's say you create an object, whatever it may be. It's a large thing, or not even a large thing, but a thing with multiple parts. In your outliner, you would typically group it together, give it a name. Now, we're going to use it a bit like that. So in this case, for this specific demo, we're going to call it a grid. That'll make more sense in a moment. So we've got our group. Now we're going to go inside of it, double click it. Specifically what we're trying to create here, let me quickly pull it up, this is one of my projects, but we're going to try and create a grid like this. But this is the final result, but you basically build a generator, let's put it that way, where you can create different kind of grids. It could be something that applies to a sci-fi environment. It could be whatever your imagination desires. I don't know. Okay, so tab again. You can hover over these menus. I typically type. So we're going to start with a grid. Right. Frame stuff, I use spacebar and G. So yeah, it can start for grid. From there, our aim is to inset each of these squares individually. But if we use our extrude node, which is a poly extrude, by default, your insets the entire thing, which we don't actually want. So we're going to change it to individual elements. So now if we insert it, it'll insert them as individual elements. Couple of other things you can do here. You can adjust the distance. You can twist it. Anything really. But for now, we'll just do an insert. Well, just do an insert, not a distance. Right. So we've got that. But now, if we go by the default selecting stuff, we need to manually select each individual square. But we do not want to do that because if we now change the grid, our selection would change. So we're going to tell Houdini we want a group of all these faces. Now we can test if we do have the group. That's just the output over here. So I just press that button. 3D connected geometry. We want geometry groups. So we've now got a group of those faces. Now, what is a group? It's a bit like, I don't know how many of you use 3ds Max, but it's a bit like having different elements within the same object. Basically, vertices are still connected. You just have a shortcut for selecting specific areas. Right, so we've got that. Now, the next step is we want to extrude that further. But if we now take a poly extrude, by default, we extrude this, it's still extruding the entire thing, which we don't want. So we're going to go to the top that says group, and we're going to grab our front group. Now, if we extrude, only that piece is extruding. Good start. From there, we're going to add a blast node because we didn't want those faces, we want holes. So we're going to blast. Blast is a bit like a delete node. I'd say that's probably the most accurate description. And we've got our first problem. Our geometry has disappeared because we did not tell it to delete specifically that group. Great. We've got a group for the most part. Now, we can do a couple of things. We can add bevels if we want. So we can do a poly bevel. Adjust the distance. Add divisions if we want to. Whatever we really want to do. And from here, we can even get UVs if we want. Do a UV rapidly. That one. Okay. UV unwrap. And we can do a UV layout as well. Because I don't know how many of you have done grid type of objects, but if you've ever tried to do UVs and Maya with an object that has this many edges to cut, it's a tedious process to say the least. So we've got a UV layout. I'm leaving these at default, by the way, the UV unwrap. The UV layout, I'm going to change to stack identical islands so that it doesn't give me these faces all as separate pieces. Well, it'll all be basically stacked on top of each other. So we go and we've got our UV viewport. We've got lovely UVs. Now herein lies one of the downsides of Houdini. You can't, well, I'm sure there's ways of manually moving UVs around, but it's not exactly the most optimal way of doing UVs. It's great for cutting UVs, but if you've got really specific parameters for placing your UVs and your UDIM texture set, whatever you use, it's not ideal. So you can quickly get UVs, and if you adjust things later down the line, your UVs automatically update, which is brilliant, but you know, there's downside too. Right, so we've got our grid, basically, more or less, but we can further And we can refine it, but we can also, what I like to call a control, which is basically a null, put one at the end. So what that'll do, eventually I'll have to set it up first, but the intention behind it is that I don't have to go back up here to adjust the size. Or if I wanted to have a different extrude, I won't have to go back up there either. So there's two ways of doing this. You can code it. I'm not a coder. I'm not good at coding, probably because I didn't have that much experience with coding, but that's besides the point. So the way I do this is I go to the null, edit parameter interface, and I grab floats. Now, I'm not going to go into the differences between floats and vectors, all that fun stuff, but for now, we're just going to have floats. We want one for the width, we want one for the length, we want one for the columns, and we want one for the rows. I think we don't have enough. Let's delete that one. That one. We want that one. Okay, so labels. Let's do length. And we're going to do width. And let's apply changes. Columns. No, the columns. And rows. Right. Apply the changes, accept, and so on and so forth. Right, so now this does, well, nothing. So copy the length parameter. So that's just right clicking on length. Copy parameter, going back up, grid. All right. So let's say, yeah, let's do this as length. So again, right clicking, paste relative references. And now our grid has disappeared. That's it. Go back down to the null. You can adjust length. Brilliant. Right, we've got length. Then the same for the width. I'm not going to go through all of them because otherwise we'll be here till tomorrow, but I will show, let's say, columns. And going back down, adjusting them out. But here's where the fun part comes in, because now you've got, well, different types of grids. Now you've got one with one seam down the middle, you can have none, you can have more, you can have squares, you can have rectangles. Possibilities are pretty endless. If you, let's say you have one there, I should have connected this one, but I didn't. So we're going to do a pan. You can do that, and you've got a window pane. Possibilities, right. So that's a very basic model. But we're now going to kind of build on top of that. Well, we'll use similar techniques in some scenarios, but we're going to create something different. So we're going to need another geometry node. We're going to call this one archway. And this one, we're going to go over specifically booleans and lines, all that fun stuff. So start with a line. Line. Going to frame it. Right, so line. Quick thing I've noticed, by default, the points, which is this button over there, that's basically, it's not a vertice, but it's kind of like a vertice. They're quite small by default, so if they're too small for you, you can go over to, I believe, guides, and then change the point marker size. So they're larger or smaller, depending on what you prefer. I prefer a bit of a larger point. You can also save this as just your default setting if you prefer. But yeah, make of that what you will. Now, to get an archway, we need a few things. Firstly, we need normals, because lines, unfortunately, do not come with normals by default. So we need a normal direction, but we also need curve view. Now, curve view is a bit difficult to explain, but I'd say it's a bit like using a mask in Substance Painter. Basically, it's just a way of knowing what's top and what's bottom. In very simple terms, but yeah, make of that what you will. So let's start with the curve view. So for that, we're going to need a resample node. Now, a sample node has multiple uses. You can firstly, the obvious, use it to basically subdivide a curve line, anything like that. So you'll notice I have more points now. Right, so that's one use. But you can also go down here and activate curve view. You can also view curve view by going to the option box over here and turning it on. So there you can kind of see what it looks like. Move that back, turn that back off. Right, so we've got that, but now we need normal. So for that, we're going to need an attribute grid. So plug that in, view it, all that fun stuff. But we still don't have normals. So firstly, you're going to name it because Houdini needs to know what you're trying to create. Sorry, my mouse was over that, but I just added an in there. The next thing, normal specifically as a vector. I'm again not going to go into the differences between floats and vectors, but for normal, you need vector. And then default will be 1 and value will be 1. This basically determines the direction. So you'll see that there. Right, so we've got our normals and we've got our curve view and we've got our line. Next step will be attribute file. So plug that in. Now this is one of the areas where you could code it instead. I personally have not written the code for it, but I have used code for it. But I prefer this method. So double click to go inside of that. And because Houdini is brilliant, you've already got your points, you've already got your normals, you've got everything basically. Except Houdini is brilliant, but it's not that brilliant. You don't have your curve view. So now we need a way to tell Houdini, well, I've got my curve view up here, but I want it inside here. So you need to import it. But it's not called import, it's called a bind. So we're going to search for a bind. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, Houdini is very, very dependent on spelling. So if you spell it incorrectly, it won't work. But we want the curve view. So we're telling basically Houdini we want to import the curve view. Right. So what else do we need? We need a ramp. And now what the ramp will do is it will be used to create the curve and the shape of the curve. So we're going to add a ramp. Ramp parameters to be specific. So curve view will go into the input of the ramp. We'll change the ramp to a float so that we can get, well, one of these guys. And then because Houdini is brilliant, we've got a displace along normal. Now, what does that mean? It basically means, for those of you that have done a bit of texturing, it's basically a displacement map, except, yeah, let's keep it simple. It's basically a displacement. So point or P goes into point and ramp goes into amount. We'll quickly move this down because it's a bit in the way. Also, if the wonky lines bother you, you can press Shift S to get nicer flowing lines. And then, yeah, displacement goes into P. And nothing happened because the control for, so you build it in here, but the actual control for it lies on the outside. So now we need to, what have I done? Oh, I just added an extra point. Read that. So now we've got our system to build our curve. For this case, I'm going to flip it around and we're going to change it to Bezier because that gives a nicer curve, and change the shape. I'm noticing we've got a very flat arch here, so I'm going to go back up to the line and we're going to adjust the length to maybe 2. Right. So we've basically got our curve, but only one side of it. So we need a mirror. So we're going to mirror. Right, mirror is done. Next problem, let's say this problem. We want to use this eventually as a Boolean. But the problem is if I do an ends, which will basically create a face in between the curves. And let's change that to clear straight. It does that. Now, why does it do that? Because we've got this lovely thing called point numbers. Each point has a number. But if you zoom in, I'm not sure if you're actually going to be able to see this. But one side, this side has 40, and that side has like 19. So what Houdini is basically doing is it's taking the smallest number of this side and the largest number and connecting in between those points. So let's say the smallest point is at the bottom and the largest smallest number is at the bottom and the largest number is at the top. Well, it connects that way, and the same for the opposite side. So we want a way to get the point numbers to go that way. So from 0 to, well, 50 or whatever it may be. So we're going to use a drawing node. And it fixes it for us. So we've now got an archway, which is great. We can now use this Boolean. We can do extrudes and all that fun stuff, but we can also do a sweep. And we'll run into a problem here that you'll see in a second. To round. It's going weird again, despite the drawing. And the reason for that is normal direction. The normals on this side is facing that way, but the normals on that side is facing that way. So we need a way to orient the normals. We're going to orient along the curve. So orient along curve. And if you view it, you'll notice the normals now follow the direction. If you sweep it, you've got a curve. Right, so we've now got an archway, we've got the base for the Boolean. So let's extrude the Boolean. So poly extrude. Adjust the distance. We do want the back because you'll notice there's a hole at the back. So we want to say output the back as well. Brilliant. Put that as something like 1. Now, got our Boolean, well, shape to Boolean into another shape, and we've got our frame. So we need something like a box or a cube or something to use. So I'm quickly going to template this so we can see how big it is. It's quite small. So the first thing I want to do is currently, if I just adjust the height of this cube, it goes in both directions, which is fine, but I don't want that. So I'm going to copy parameter and paste it into the center. The center, before I paste it, I'll show you what the center is, basically where it is in the world in the sense of height. So we'll paste that in and divide it, no, times it, no, multiply it by 0.5. So it's basically like dividing it. I should prefer using multiplication. I don't know why, it's weird, but I do it. So we've got that. Now, if we adjust the height, only the height will be adjusted. Brilliant. Next, we want to adjust the width. Not that width, this width. Great. So we've got our things all set up. So now we're going to need a Boolean. Quick note on Booleans, the topology is questionable at best. You will either have to retopper it or you will have to triangulate it eventually. That's just unfortunately nature of Booleans. Or you can remesh it, but that's also sometimes wonky. So you'll notice it just cut off the back of the actual one we want to Boolean, so that means it's subtracting the wrong one. So we can change it here. And herein lies our next problem. It's not going all the way through. And maybe down the line we want thicker or thinner walls and we want the Boolean to adjust accordingly. So we're going to take the box and copy the width and then go and add a transform. to this one, right? So first thing we're going to want to do is paste it into the position. I tested this, I believe it's at 0.6, and then at scale, yeah, that's about right. Scale will be firstly paste times 1.2 should be enough or not. Let's change it to, okay, it's going too far forward. Sometimes it requires a little bit of moving around. I should have went 0.5. 0.5 is always such a brilliant number. Right, we've got a Boolean. Brilliant. Next thing, we've got this sweep. So we do want to merge this down the line, so combine it so we can see everything. So let's do a merge. And currently our frame is in the, okay, wait, sorry, reading the chat, converting into VDBs, doing the Boolean operations, and then converting back to polygons can help with cleaner topology as well, but that's beyond the lecture. That is an option as well. I've not done a lot of VDBs, but as it is an option, probably the more procedural way to do it than retopology. Although I find retopology quite fun actually, so I don't skip that. I don't find workarounds for it. I just do it because why not? Okay, so we've got our, so we need an arch. In this case, it's going to be the width of the wall times definitely 0.5. So 0.5, and then we're going to create another one. Oh, by the way, to duplicate, it's just Alt and drag. And then we'll do that. Minus 0.5. Brilliant. We've got our archway all done and dusted. Which we can test it around. Let's see what it does. So firstly, the first thing we want to see is if it actually moves alongside, and it does, right? The next fun part is you can change the shape, which who doesn't want to change the shape? It's fun. Now, I'm not going to build a control for the entirety of this neck grid, but some things you would want to be able to adjust, probably the width of the wall, the length of the wall, the height of the wall, that type of thing. Also for the height of the line specifically, possibly you would want to adjust the amount of segments. So let's check on points. You might want to have more or less. And so on and so forth. But what I will show you, because it is a bit different than what we did with the grid, is the control for the ramp. So specifically the curve. So add a null, go to edit, and add a ramp float. So I'm not going to label this, but we're going to apply it. Copy this parameter, and then go down to the attribute, right click on the ramp, and paste relative references. And now it's gone completely bonkers. But let's switch that around. If I'm on the right one, actually. There you go. And change it back to busy. And now you can adjust your curve again. So it's basically the same thing. It's just slightly different button. You use a ramp instead of float, or a ramp float instead of float. But yeah, that gets the job done. And that kind of concludes the, let's say, demo section. But now I'm kind of going to go over how these tie into, well, bigger projects, because no one is going to make just a grid or just one archway, because why? Quickly going to hide these two. Let's start with the door. Right. turning off points because it's a crazy amount. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick rundown of how I made each thing, but I'll also do a bit of a walkthrough through some of the sections that the previous demos didn't cover. So firstly, these guys, just Booleans, nothing too complicated. Anything that is complicated or more complicated is probably the profile of this, because you can add a custom profile to your sweep. But I made that in Maya. I did not do that in Houdini, mostly due to time constraints, because I only had a certain amount of time to pull this off. So plans had to be made. Right, so that's one part of it. The next part is these guys are all just lines with curves. It's archway, the archway is within them. These guys, well, all of them basically, except for these circles. They're done a bit differently. So they're made with circles instead of lines. And they don't require coding. Actually, getting back to coding, quickly going to jump off track. In between, sorry, we're looking at the chat quickly. Wow, how much time did it take in between Houdini and mine? Of this, I probably spent about 2 weeks on this door specifically. For the actual Maya part, Retopo I spent a little bit of time on, probably an hour or two. But for the rest was pretty standard. I did make a tower as well, but that was a train wreck, but I'm not going to show you. Because that was my first, I tried to do a cathedral tower with no experience of Houdini and no experience on, how do I put this? No experience of Houdini and no experience of procedural modeling. So that was a bit interesting. But yeah, quickly going to go and find the coding for you guys. That's all that in code. This was how. Well, this is the alternative to doing the attribute block. You can just type in this code and be on your way. My teacher actually did the coding during my studies. But yeah, so I used that. Getting back on track here, we've got a circle. Again, size is used to determine the position. So otherwise, because without that, well, the circle would go below the floor, and we don't want that. Changing that to factor 0.2. Next thing we have is a copy and transform. Now, what is a copy and transform? A copy and transform is basically a way of, well, multiplying transform. So basically, each copy is multiplying whatever you transform. So if I change the scale, this is the first duplicate, so it's a tiny bit bigger. But the next duplicate is a lot bigger. Right, so it's that. Specifically to get this shape, I copied the total number, pasted it into the rotation, and did 360 divided by the number of copies. So if I change the copies, well, it changes along with it. Too complicated, but yeah, that's about that. And then if you quickly look at points, we notice our first problem, we don't have a point in the corner. So for that, I did a Boolean with a union instead of a subtract. And then a dissolve. Now, dissolve that edge specifically. This is a labs thing. It's a bit like a plugin. Wait, let me show you guys where you can get it. Multiple screens is an interesting experience. I'm not used to working on 2 screens actually. So let's pull that over. You can get it here. Just install packages and, well, I did production build, quite honestly. If you ask me what the difference between production and daily build is, I would have to Google it. I went mini, which one will work. And I just downloaded one. Again, this was probably in my earlier stages of my 3D journey. But yeah, so that's that. Then I did a convert to-line thing, which is grayed out because I eliminated it. I had to go through this file when I wanted to do these demos and stuff, and I had to kind of figure out what the plan was. I don't know why I added a conversion line because it turns out it was irrelevant. So grayed out. From there, again, a join. I've added a circle at exterior, pretty standard. Group that is irrelevant because, as I said, this was quite early on in my journey. Secondly, it was an experience. It was better than my tower, but it's at the beginning phase of my journey. And then, well, you've got the circle and so on and so forth. Basically just circles built upon each other, and so on. Now, I did not implement controls in any place in this entire thing. So how my system worked is I would make the control nodes a lighter color, which means my size of my circles, my transforms, everything was at different places, which means I had to navigate this node network a billion times just to make one small adjustment, which is not optimal. Which is why I also showed you guys how to implement controls, because it simplifies things. Another thing, I didn't really make it fully procedural because, yeah, these change, but those don't change accordingly, so they don't move alongside me scaling this one, which isn't ideal either. I would want ideally to have, well, controls for each individual one, but I'd also want a control for the overall thing. So that's, well, hindsight. So let's go back to the, let's say, entire thing. That kind of covers these shapes. The other place I probably want to go over is the mandala. It's done a bit differently. It's not done with lines, it's done with curves, but it's still, you can still edit it. And then I'll probably talk about the towers off to the side. So, mandala, going to find it. Okay, found it. So, let's view it. We've got, okay, quickly checking the comments. I'm not very good at checking the comments. I'm so sorry, guys. Okay, so I think my teacher pulled your work up on ArchStation the other day. That is incredibly cool, actually. So thank you. And Houdini is gateway into tech art. Yes, it is. I'll get more into that later. Production build is a stable build and daily build is experimental new features. Thank you. That's good to know because I've sometimes download one, sometimes download the other and hope for the best. And then Houdini is like Path Excel skill tree. Yes, for sure. Definitely is. Yeah, curve. Getting back on track. I'm not very good at multitasking. So got a curve, you can edit it. Have fun with it, and everything will adjust accordingly. So it's still somewhat procedural, but it's not like working with ramps. Then I did a resample, group, basic stuff. What else is interesting in here? Got a little details, transforms. That's nothing of that is interesting. I used a copy and transform to get these guys circles, so that's something. It's basically the same thing I did before, except I did it manually, which is not ideal. I should have did the 360 times or whatever. Yeah, that's about that. And then if you merge it, the other thing that I did that was quite odd, not odd, but different. Why? I pressed W. That's why it's a wireframe. So I split the sweep into 3 different phases because I wanted different size sweeps. I don't think that's quite ideal. In my profile for this custom sweep, I'm not going to get into because I made a complete mess of it and did not do it similarly. I could have optimized it better, so we're not going to get into that. Quickly going back to the curve, maybe I can show you guys what happens if you adjust it, find it, template there. thing. Okay, this might be a little bit hard to see, but let's try it. So if I change these parameters, the whole thing obviously adjusts accordingly, which is very nice. So, you know, Houdini is brilliant. What can I say? Other thing I wanted to talk about is the tower. I'm going to have to find it. Here it is. Right, tower base. So cylinder, basic stuff, did an extrude on it on the wrong side. Why did I do it on the wrong side? I can't tell you. Favorite and least favorite thing about using the Vex. Memorizing the notes. I don't like memorizing the notes. Yeah. So convert line. Okay, so that's basically basic stuff, just another sweep at the top. But I used a copy and transform, so now I can adjust the amount of segments on my tower relatively easily. Yeah, and that about sums up this tower. I'd say this is a typical your first or somebody's first. Well, I mean, it was definitely my first introduction to properly trying to do something procedurally. Which means a lot of it is not optimal. There's a lot of cool elements in it and fun elements in it, but it's not quite the way I would have done it if I were to do it now. So let's get into a bit more, say, complicated, possibly complicated model, which is this boat. Right. So we've got a control at the bottom per usual. Now, for the boat specifically, there's only one thing I would have done differently. Well, there's probably a lot I could have done differently, but there's one area specifically that bothers me, and I'll get into that. But, well, two actually, sorry. So we've got different controls. We can adjust the length. We can adjust the height, which you'll quickly see what the problem here is. We've got a problem in the center there. But I'll get into that. We can adjust the width of the bottom. We can adjust the width of the top. We can adjust the amount of planks. We can adjust the width of the benches. We can adjust the amount of the benches. We can adjust the spacing, so more or less. We can adjust the position of the spacing, so let's quickly have more, so we can kind of see what's happening. So we can kind of, well, choose a pattern. What do you want to do? What pattern do you want? So yeah, that's that. But then here comes the fun stuff. We can adjust the front profile. The lighting on this is terrible, but hopefully you'll still be able to see what's going on. So we've got these controls. We can adjust sorts of fun stuff. And then we can adjust things from the top. This actually ties into one of the mistakes I made. I should have added a control of the ramps at the bottom, because now I have to scroll up to the top to get the controls. It's very straightforward to do the ramps. Well, they do the controls for the ramps, but at the time I actually did not know how to do it. It's one of those things. But yeah, we can adjust the profile from the top, but we can also adjust the slope over there, and we can adjust the slope. Now, how does this tie into, let's say, the previous things I showed? Well, firstly, it's all sweeps, and it's all made with lines. Without the sweep, I don't know, did I conveniently do the sweep at the end? I did not. That's very inconvenient. Probably, where did I do the... Let's see if I can figure this out quickly. Probably not. Okay, so basically the exterior shape is determined by these lines. Then I've got lines that goes obviously through the top of them, and I've got a line that goes through the bottom. And everything is built off that. I'm not going to go too deep into this because, well, again, as I said, the session was quite lengthy. We're already at 50 minutes over. So if I went through every node, we would probably be here till tomorrow, which is an option, but some people like to sleep, so including myself. So yeah, but getting back on track, let me just quickly go and view the bottom so we can see what the whole picture is. Here's one of the mistakes. So when I did the skin, so the skin basically, well, skins. So it adds a skin to the curves. Now, due to the fact that I use separate curves for the front and for the sides, the point numbers don't quite line up. There are ways around this. I, again, did not have time to fully explore that. But be that as it may, I needed to find a way to somewhat procedurally eliminate these freaking faces in the middle. But the problem is, for some reason, normals specifically, I did try selecting normals via or grouping by normals, and that works for this one specifically. But further down the line, I use a different setup, and the normals don't work for that. So by that, due to that, I had to use bounding boxes. Now the problem is I did not link my bounding box to my controls. So what I should have done is link the control to this bounding box so that when I scaled the boat, the height adjusts accordingly as well as the length. And that would tie in with the one at the bottom, which is related to the plank angles. So these lines were my biggest problem when it came to normal direction not working. Because I obviously blasted these center ones out here as well. So yeah, that about sums up this this boat, and as well as, let's say, the demo and walkthrough section of this session, event, whatever we want to call it. So moving on. Next phase, how is this relevant to the 3D industry? Well, firstly, in my personal opinion, it's a very marketable skill. Who doesn't want somebody that can do something, well, create an iteration for a project or a block out or anything really quicker than the standard modeling techniques? For example, what if you could quickly generate environment? Like buildings, automatically get your doors and windows cut in with booleans, and your sweeps would make your door frames and your window frames, and then you'd be on your way to basically showing a city block out to, well, whoever is your upper line, whether that be an art director or a lead or a senior, whatever it may be. But you could also, yes, exactly, why model one book when you can model billions? And the fun thing is, so let's say I can do objects as well. So let's say well, in my case, I made a rowboat. Well, what if I worked on a project that needed 10 boats? Well, I can now make 10 boats. What if down the line they needed something similar again? Well, I've still got this wonderful network that I can reuse. And because it's all made of sweeps, UVs are done. I'll get back to that. Now that's a start, but is it enough to justify learning all these nodes? I don't know. So let's go over some other possibilities. You can resize or shape clothing if your base mesh, let's say you have a male and female base mesh, but the topology is the same, like same amount of polygons. Obviously, position would be different. You can do that in Houdini. So you can resize and shape your clothing for, let's say, also taller or shorter base meshes. You can build tools to rename, which is brilliant, by the way, because I've got a friend that did some coding for me in Houdini, because as we went over, I'm atrocious at coding. So basically, I was working on a project and I had to rename 250 pieces of geometry. And at the end of the end name was basically, it said geo and then a number. And then the number, they wanted the number moved to before the geo, but I didn't really care what the number was. but they wanted the number before the geo, not after the geo. So coding can do that for you. And obviously, as we went over before, UVs automatically update as your model because Houdini is brilliant. Granted, layout is the thing, but you have UVs. And then more recently, I think they've implemented textures. You can texture Houdini procedurally. So you've updated your models and your UVs and your textures update as well. I believe you can even bake in Houdini now. So that's brilliant. Now let's say you're working on a project and you need to render 5 different cameras. And it's late at night and you want to go to bed. Well, you can render them as a sequence in succession. You do need to do a bit of wangling from this way to that way, but you can do it. And then once you have it set up, you click a button and it renders. And when you come back to your PC in the morning, well, you've got your 5 renders. You can also program it to render them all at once with a tiny, well, I'd say the problem with that is, I don't know about you guys, but my PC would die if I rendered 5 different cameras at once. But the option is there. Point is, the possibilities stretch about as far as your imagination goes. It's only a question of how you achieve it. Is it common to do the entire workflow in Houdini, or most pipelines still move it into other programs, moving and texturing? I will get back to that, but we'll get to that in a moment. Quickly going to finish this section because it'll be like 5 minutes and we're done, and then I'll get back to questions. So, having said all this, what roles in the industry do these skills apply to? Traditionally speaking, these types of things fall under the role of a technical artist or sometimes a technical director, along with rigging and coding stuff like that. Personally, if there wasn't coding involved, I'd love to be a technical artist, but maybe I'll get over my fear of coding one day. So, one day one can dream. But I've also seen it applying to environment artists as well. It's worth mentioning that on the environment side of things, I think it's a more specialized skill, which means it's not necessarily as, I would say it's not in demand. It's definitely in demand, but I think perhaps, at least in smaller scale studios, they wouldn't necessarily need you to be able to do it. But I mean, sell it. If you could sell Houdini, you're well on your way to having a fun time. Okay, so that's the relevance of procedural modeling in the 3D industry. I'm quickly going to go over the pros and cons again. Again, it kind of ties into a previous section, but for, let's say, to condense it down, we can quickly go over those. So for cons, VDBs aside, retopo is required when using booleans or some form of triangulation. Yeah, it's a thing. It's slower than modeling by hand. It's a lot slower than modeling by hand. And that's just the reality because you have to build a network and it's a lot of trial and error. You do run into technical difficulties along the way. For example, like I did with the boat, and I had this mid section that I needed to find a way to eliminate. Right. Takes a lot of time to master. You need to learn a lot of Node. You need to learn a bit of coding, probably more than a bit of coding, and a bunch of other nodes. Then, of course, UVs automatically update, but their layout may not be optimal. I don't think it's probably still applicable to film, but I think games especially want very specific UVs. Right, some of the pros. You can quickly generate multiple versions of an object. You can make adjustments. Overall look of an object at the click of a button, or a few buttons, depending on how many alterations. As I said, it's a marketable skill, and you can build tools to speed up the workflow of a project. Like, for example, let's say you're building a cathedral and you need to have 20 different windows. Well, build a generator for that. You can place tedious tasks like naming,
And now this is a bit of can of worms that I'm not going to go too deep into, but in my personal opinion, I think it's a bit of a difficult skill to replace with AI. It's one of those things. Because in my personal opinion, AI is very result driven, but if you have 10 things you want to change to very specific parameters, I think it's very difficult to tell AI, I want exactly this thing. And I want you to make exactly these 10 changes to these degrees. Where if you build the whole network and you have a button you can press. So yes. And I think that about, there's more, but I'm not going to go too much into that. But I think that concludes that section as well. So we can actually probably go into the Q&A phase. Those of you that have questions, I will quickly answer the ones that I missed. But yeah, those of you that don't have questions are obviously welcome to leave if you want to, but those that do can stick around, or just those interested. So moving back up, is it common to do the entire web in or do most livelines still move it into other programs for UV and texturing? I believe at this stage, at least, people aren't UVing and texturing in Houdini. It was very recently implemented. If you guys want to go look up Brian Bentley on YouTube, he has done some videos of that. I'll quickly put it in the chat. I'm not going to just his name so you can find him on YouTube. But he has done some stuff specifically on texturing and Houdini. So there's that. I hope in the future it'll be more common. As for coding being scary, not being scary, it's scary as a beginner. It's scary as a beginner. And tech artists are more common in AAA. Often they just want generous artists. I agree. Especially in your countries like South Africa, they want general artists, and they don't just want like modeling in general. They want you to animate, they want you to model, they want you to do lighting, they want you to do rigging, they want you to do everything. But that's pretty standard for, let's say, indie studios. Started using Houdini now and are full-time as a software engineer. That's pretty cool. How should I go about learning Houdini as a beginner? I have used Maya for 12 years in layout and asset modeling. So I started in an unconventional way. I basically looked up, it's such a shame, but there was this guy that did specifically a video about modeling a cathedral in Houdini and had it on YouTube. I believe he's Adam Lambert. No, he's not Adam. He's A something Lambert. But he's since moved his tutorials over to something else. But I think the basics there's basic tutorials of procedural modeling on YouTube. And I think that's the best place to start. It's not how I personally learned, because I learned through my studies at CG Spectrum, but it's totally possible to learn through YouTube. It's just, how do I put this? It's basically like learning any skill. You need to go and follow the tutorial, do the step-by-step, and then take what you learned and apply it to a new project that uses the same skills and maybe one additional skill, and go from there to try and memorize the different aspects of it. Because unfortunately, copy and pasting procedural modeling, a lot gets lost. You learn a lot more through your own trial and error. SOP workflow. I have done some modeling in SOPs, but not recently. So yeah, but it's possible. It's actually quite fun, but it's something I need to brush up on. Great
great suggestions on YouTube channels. A portfolio of procedural modeling. Adrian Lambert, that's the one. He also has a great. Okay, so I'm going to quickly ask a question for Johnny. You asked, could you give us a suggestion for portfolio of procedural modeling? I want a bit of clarification on that. Do you want examples of good portfolios showcasing that, or do you want to know what your portfolio should look like if you were to showcase your procedural modeling, if that makes sense? Right. OnSOP's just the regular modeling workflow though. Is it though? Trying to remember. This was a long time ago. This was a year ago that I did it. I'll look a bit more into that and kind of get back to you on that. Do you render everything using Mantra, or do you use a different pipeline like T4D or Nuke? I use Solaris. I render everything in Solaris using Carmen. It's what I learned on. I have not used Mantra at all, actually. I highly recommend Solaris. It's amazing. You can also animate cameras and stuff on it. It's fun. But you can probably do a Mantra as well. But you know, besides the point. How long did it take you to feel confident and comfortable to using Houdini once you opened it, played for? I would say 6 months. It took me a while to get used to it. But I would also say, I'd say my journey wasn't as traditional because I had one-on-one support from somebody that was experienced with Houdini. So I would say probably add a few extra months onto it if you're going to go the self-study route. Karma render and Solaris, which there's new Karma render. Wait, is there more than one of? Oh, like okay, let me rephrase. How new is this Karma renderer? Because if it's like 6 months old, I've definitely used it. If it's more recent, I've probably not.